Hanse, Tawau, welcome everyone. I hope you're enjoying your summer. I'm Janine Windolf. I'm the Director of Indigenous Arts, and I'm pleased to host today's Decolonizing the Narrative to a very talented friend and someone I worked with in our Digital Constellations program, Loretta Todd, who also is responsible for the IM4 program. And so together we're happy to help share a little bit of work that Loretta has been working on over the years. And as I always acknowledge, is also someone who has paved the path for filmmakers like myself. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm joining here from Sacred Guardian Buffalo Mountain at the Banff Centre on the Treaty 7 territory. And so as part of what I like to do is I like to acknowledge the Buffalo spirit that's with us today. And so welcome, Loretta. I'm going to turn it over for you to present. And anyone in the chat, if you want to share where you're joining from, that'd be great.
Thank you so much, Janine. It's really an honor to be here. It's really a pleasure. I looked at all the other people who have spoken as part of your decolonizing narrative program, and all people that I admire and respect and look up to. So I feel very honored to be included in that group, and also very much value all the work you're doing at the Banff Centre and all the work that you have done, and of course your team at the Banff Centre as well. Much respect to them. We had some tech stuff getting ready doing this, so hopefully they're all resolved. And that's why I'm sitting on this cushy recliner chair instead of at my desk, because for some reason my computer at my desk wasn't allowing me to share in a way that I hope would be good for the viewers. So we sorted it out. Very first thing I'd like to do is also acknowledge I'm here on the Squamish people's territory, unceded territories of Gibsons, outside of Vancouver. And I just want to kind of ground myself, because I'm always a little nervous when I do these things, especially online. It's always easier to do them in person. So I'm going to just, if you're all okay, I'm just going to do a very short prayer. Great mystery, grandmothers and grandfathers, thank you for this day, the sunshine, this breath. Today, help all the negative energy to leave me, for obstacles to evaporate like morning mist. Thank you for all the good energy and love all around. I ask that my words and images do no harm. Guide and protect our loved ones, and guide and protect the storytellers as they do this important work. Hi, all my relations. Okay, so decolonizing. So I'm going to you're going to hear things probably, maybe some of you may have heard before, and some things you may have never heard before. And I wrote this all up, but I'm going to, hopefully I don't have to read all of it, but some of it I will read. So when I was young, I wanted to be a ballerina. I didn't even know what that was. I never saw a ballet, just what you'd probably call fake ballet in old movies that I would watch with my mom. So more Jean Kelly than Margot Fontaine, but never the Nutcracker, because that is the worst ballet ever, except perhaps the National Ballet version of it with the incredible Russian village set with all the costumes and amazing light and the winter's night lighting on a huge stage. But to me, whatever it was really, I thought it was ballet. But get this, I would dance in our living room, not powwow or jigging or tap dancing or disco. I would literally put my hands out like this, and I would go from one end of the room to the other end of the room with my head looking the way toward the wall I was going toward. And then when I would touch the wall with my fingers, I would quickly turn my head as if I was doing some kind of tango and go back the other way. Now, of course, I did this over and over again, and to hilarious laughter and relentless teasing from my brothers and sisters. But I was dancing. I was a ballerina. And it wasn't like I was 4, I was probably like 6. So to my siblings, even more reason to tease and of course make fun of me. Then my mom said I would have to get my lower ribs removed to be a dancer. So that sounded wrong. So I gave that up. And of course, where would I study ballet? 8 kids on welfare, where would there be money? Though my mom did always find little extras for us, like swimming lessons that in the end I didn't go to after the first class. So she must have known that I wasn't too good in places where I didn't feel welcome. But many years later, after being this 13-year-old runaway, then teen mom, I decided I was going to finally learn ballet. I joined a teenage dance class because it was by age, studying ballet with pretty white girls from the West Side who looked at me with disdain, even ridicule, occasionally pity. But I changed the narrative of my life. I became the ballet dancer. Well, I could do grand jetés, and I had natural turnout, and I had, as they call it, and I had high, great extension. Never point, because I have big, flat feet, good for running over the prairie. But it was fun, and I felt power. Is that decolonizing narratives? Is the first decolonization, is the first decolonizing, is the decolonizing of our own lives and our own stories? But have I mean, decolonized, that is. I mean, ballet is all about Western tuxedo art based on movement appropriated from various folk dances and twisted into a form that distorts the body. I mean, do I live like the elders I respect, with art, life, storytelling, all intertwined, never separate from daily life, never dependent on grants or talks at art centers or neoliberal art consumption, or needing the approval of corporate bosses, from public broadcasters to Hollywood studios, just living life as art? Can I truly be that decolonized in an industry that it's by its nature is an extension of colonialism and intertwined to its younger brother, capitalism? What would decolonizing the narratives look like? So, well, we all kind of have a general understanding and a visceral experience of colonization. It is our children no longer on this earth who never got to live to be elders and make art and feed their family just because they were sent to a school to get assimilated and didn't come home. It is homelessness in your own territories lived by your ancestors since time out of mind. It's only having to occupy a reserve land base representing 0.2% of all of Canada, the 2.2 economy, as the late Art Manuel called it. Here I am quoting, the 0.2% economy is meant to dehumanize First Nations so that Canadians can forget that First Nations poverty is made in Ottawa, so they can point fingers at systemic deprivation and call it failing, and how it, and to quote, the fact is too many Canadians are born on third base and are celebrating like they got home runs, which is a quote from Sherry Pasternak in the Canadian Dimension. So what about the storytelling industry, the media, the infrastructure, whatever we want to call it, where we are bringing our stories to be able to be heard and seen, and yes, making a living and create our own form of intergenerational security for our future generations? It also has many at third bases thinking that they've made home runs. A systemic stranglehold on fair and equitable access and redistribution of wealth. It is systemic colonialism there too, but I'm not going to go into that. And I will recognize that change is happening, though powers systems seem to replicate themselves, so that is happening too. But back to where I am about decolonizing narratives from the perspective of my storytelling, my thoughts about storytelling. But before I go there, I believe it is critical that we have to directly link our stories and decolonizing narratives to the land, because Indigenous people over the world are responsible for 80% of the world's biodiversity by managing over 25% of land and water surface. So that sovereignty and its responsibilities are woven together with story sovereignty and those responsibilities. And we have to think about the power of media in shaping people's views of the world through selection and omission, emphasis and themes. Quoting a sociologist, Gitlin, mass media are significant social forces informing and delimiting of public assumptions, attitudes, and moods. So who gets to select or omit? Who gets to emphasize what themes? Who gets to form and delimit? And then as an artist, what do I choose or leave out? What do I emphasize and form? And if I am delimiting, which is a clumsy word, what am I delimiting and why? And so what about decolonizing the narratives of my life? And what does decolonized narrative look like, feel like, and sound like? I didn't want to be a filmmaker as a child beyond this awkward phantom ballet dancer I imagined I would be. Filmmaking wasn't something I could imagine. In fact, I sort of have a memory of thinking that old movies were made in the times that they were actually depicting. So I was seeing the real past in my child's mind. I was a stupid kid, I guess, but distinctly recall being immersed in a scene or being in a shadow in a film noir or in the garden with golden light, sort of like real life. Well, when we would arrange, well, me, and then in real life, when I was a kid, we would arrange our dolls and toys and stuffies in a corner. And then when we wake up in the morning, they would be moved around. And our mom would say, oh, that's because they come to life at night and they party. And so, yeah, my mom was the true genius because she created Toy Story before Toy Story. And I also think she also created the term, go, just do it. Because I'm convinced that when she used to live in Texas and Hawaii, where she was a nanny and her boyfriend in Texas, she used to fly a lot. And I'm sure there was some Nike guy sitting next to her one day and she was talking to him and she probably just told him, just do it. So anyways, I digress and take you off into a little eddy that, you know, isn't directly related to this story. But it made me feel immersed. It was an immersion. It was something I felt, those little dolls, those little toys. I was immersed in that world. In fact, I can even remember dreaming, being with them, amongst them, having the party at night. So when I was in film school, one of the first projects I got to make, and keep in mind, I was working full time when I was going to film school for the first year and a half, because I had to support my family, was I made a documentary for Allied Indian Métis Society, which was a halfway house, which provided services to Indigenous men who were paroled and coming out of prison. And in this video, I had a little $500 budget. I was producer, director, writer. I did the sound. I had a cameraman, but I would also carry the equipment, also set up the light, and had an actor. And the actor was supposed to be a fellow coming getting off the bus at the bus depot, walking to the halfway house, and then going into the halfway house. And there he was, safe, finally safe. But because of the confidentiality of all the people in the film, it wasn't possible for me to include them. And so there was kind of some in the background, a little bit people, but generally the person felt alone. This actor looked like they were alone in this halfway house, which on reflection later, I thought, I guess it doesn't really look like it was a welcoming place. But I was also thinking, in a way, there was a kind of, there was still an immersion. There was an immersion into place. There was immersion into safety, but there was also an immersion into loneliness. And I was thinking, is that part of my aesthetic? Is that part of my storytelling? That sense of loneliness? And I guess the other thing too is that decolonizing narrative is also about resources. So there I am, and I know there's people who have apparently made feature films on $500 budgets, although if you scratch the surface a little bit more, you would probably see that they were related to somebody who had equipment and whatever, but I'm not trying to dismiss that. But I mean, what does it mean to not have the equipment that you need? What does it mean when you kind of like, I remember I had to get the camera from a local rental place, and fortunately the guy, all I had to pay for it was a case of beer, which was to me was sort of like our ironic Canadian moment, colonial moment where the Native woman filmmaker is giving the white guy a case of beer to be able to get the camera for nothing, so I could go shoot about a little scene of a man getting out of jail, which was probably alcohol related in the first place. And then I was also decolonizing perhaps student film night. My student film for when I was at film school, I somehow long story, but the lab, because we were shooting on 16 mil, somehow ruined it. So, months of work were I couldn't use, except about 5 seconds on each end of the film. But in any case, I had to, be resourceful as an Indigenous woman, and I had been watching old movies again, and came across Cheyenne Autumn, which was a John Ford film, and in that it was one of the films in which Indigenous people were actually, mainly in the film. It wasn't just Italians playing Indigenous people, and there's a scene in which they're breaking camp, and the women are taking down the teepees and preparing to leave camp. So I made a installation, which was basically, I went out into the forest, I found poplar trees or birch trees that had fallen over, made a travois. I got some, leather to string it together, made this, I had to hang it from the ceiling so that the travois looked as if it was actually moving. And then I put on the travois a monitor, and in the monitor, I looped the breaking of camp. I looped the Indigenous woman taking down the teepee, and it looped and looped. And I remember that night, one of the people who were there, I'm sure some relative or a friend of one of the other filmmakers, saying, "Oh, that's not film." So, so much for that. But for me, it was still a form of immersion. It was my way of kind of immersing, making tactile that act of taking down camp, that act of an Indigenous woman owning the teepee, owning the means of transportation, being responsible for it, being responsible for making home, for giving shelter and giving safety. So again, it was sort of like, well, maybe you don't get it, but for me, it was a moment of immersion. It was as if a moment of seeing something like this frozen in time, and sort of bringing together the present with the virtual, if you like. But I could talk about this idea of the immersive as a strategy, or as a means, or a way of how I experience story. But it has two sides. The late brilliant artist and cultural changemaker Doreen Jensen talked about feeling immersed when listening to stories told by her elders, who were old-time elders, some who didn't go to residential school. When she got a pop-up book as a present when she was a young girl, she felt how that pop-up book was like how she experienced story when she heard her stories. She actually felt when she heard the stories that she went into the story, that she was in that moment walking around. And the pop-up books came closest to her in that sense of being immersed. And many years later, even though Doreen had a tendency to do for everyone and not always make space for her own art, she was determined to make space for her own art, and brilliantly created a giant pop-up book that was up at the Surrey Art Gallery, which I was able to see. And I felt so happy for her that she got to realize that dream, but also the fact that she was taking that idea, the idea of immersion, and taking it and expressing it in her art. The other side of immersion is what we now in this world of algorithms and social media and people going down rabbit holes, or something that, to quote Huxley, the centrifugal bumble puppy, to reference Huxley, where immersion is distraction from the burning planet and the broken spirits. So I want to fast forward to my first documentary. And I need to kind of go over here, and I need to just take a minute because I need to do this. And I will go over here and share this screen. And this was the very first film that I made, where I think, again, I was trying to kind of, I think that intuitively, I didn't really know what a documentary was. At film school, they never taught us documentary. It was an experimental film school. In fact, they kind of dismissed documentary. Documentary was kind of seen as not creative. And, but I was hired to make a documentary. It was called The Learning Path. And I was hired on Halloween night and started shooting in January in Edmonton. And I say the coldest winter in Edmonton in many, many years. And but we made this beautiful film. And in this film, one of the things I asked the beautiful people in it, who are all gone now, the late Olive Dickinson, late Eva Cardinal, and the late Dr. Ann Anderson, what kind of film did you want to make? And they want me to make, and we will make. And they said hopeful. And so the idea was to immerse us in hope. I don't really have a moment necessarily to show of hope. It's the whole experience of the film, but I thought at least I would show the opening. It's a little, we'll see whether it's very low res, because that's all I had of it. It was made 30 years ago. So we'll see what we can do.
I had a really bad experience going to junior high, and you know, I can still think about it today. And we couldn't even walk down the hallway and we'd be called Squawberry Jam. We'd be called You Wagon Burner. You know, this is just a hallway. We couldn't even walk through during recess, and we'd be called a name every day of our life.
I was growing up in a French community in northern Alberta, and there was, out of, we'll say 100 kids, there maybe 10 native kids. We always were called Indians, or savages. I was about 7 years old, and I was bugging the older boys, and these were boys that were 17, 18 years old. I can remember 3 of the boys that grabbed me, and they put a, what do you call, a skipping rope around my neck, and they were going to hang me.
So I wanted to share that because, again, you know, what is immersion? What is this sort of experience of immersion? How do you draw in people to your story? And that's one of the things that I've always done, is to try to bring people in poetically, lyrically, emotionally. You can't quite hear, unfortunately, and I'm sure other people have heard me say this before, but I try to start each film, or my documentaries at least, with an honor song. So you can hear there's a woman singing an honor song, and that's to all those children and people who were gone and who, you know, had to experience that. So she's singing an honor song to them. And that's sort of like our first act of being immersed, is coming in and of one mind and one heart, honoring these people with an honor song. I wanted to kind of just talk a little bit about documentary and some of the kind of theories around documentary, and how, you know, are they limiting to us? Are they confounding to us? Do they work or do they not work? And one of these, a guy, Bill Nichols, who's somebody I think I read at film school, talks about 6 types of documentary. He talks about the poetic, the reflexive, which would be like mockumentaries, the participatory, which would be like Michael Moore film, the observational, which would be Simmer Verte, and then the expository, which are, you know, most docs that we see. But what about this immersive? Is it really just poetic? And I'm just giving it another name. Taking you into a scene through art within the documentary to illuminate, to comfort, to heal, to grieve. I wanted to, I see we don't have a lot of time, so, and I still have a lot to cover, so I think I will just kind of jump into a story that I have shared with people before. So, but I think it's still important to share. And that is the idea that as a filmmaker, it's really critical and important that we, to me anyways, it's like, where do I draw my inspiration? Where do I draw my aesthetic? And one of them is from oral history. But what does that mean? I remember Victor Maciaspa, who's the Hopi filmmaker, says, we can't replicate the ceremonial life. We can't replicate, you know, oral tradition. We're not meant to replace it as filmmakers, as storytellers. But we can use the tools that are part of oral history. And so what does that mean? Like, what is oral history? What's having, and, you know, we definitely record things. We record things through art. We record things through many different ways. So it's not that we weren't recording things, but we relied very much on the experience of witnessing, the experience of ceremony, the experience of transmitting knowledge through memory and word and story. So how do we put that? How do we draw upon that as filmmakers, storytellers? And the story I tell is sort of, and I'll try to do it really quickly, is when they opened the First Nations House of Learning out at UBC with the lovely and brilliant Dr. Verna Kirkness and Dr. Joanne Archibald, who were responsible for raising all the money that they would need to make this very, very, very important and very, very significant place at UBC. It was probably one of the First Nations House of Learnings across Canada. And they had an opening ceremony, and it was a beautiful sunny summer day. And they had on the deck outside, they were honoring the people, many people who were part of this, but particularly the very wealthy people who have made donations to the making of this. And they were blanketing them, and they were giving them a name. And I know that sort of what appeared to be randomly, they were picking people from the many people who were there in front of the stage to come forward. And as each person was given their name, they were told a story about that person and why the name was being given to them. And that went on. And then each person would have another person come up and witness that. And at the end of that, they said to those people who were there, now you are a witness. You have to remember everything we said about this name and why they were given this name and what the name means. And when we gather again to remember this time, whether it's 10 years or 20 years or even 100 years, you or your family have to come forward and recite that, to give that back, and to remember that, to remember the giving of this story. And I remember thinking at the time, gee, I'm so glad they didn't ask me, because I don't think I could remember. But at the same time, I was thinking, how would I remember? And then I thought, well, you know, here we are on a sunny day. Here we are, and there's kids running around. Here we are with dogs barking over there and cars, horns going off. This cloud passing in front of the sun at one moment, and creating a bit of a shadow. And I was thinking, that's how I remember. I would immerse myself in that moment. I would be in that moment, and I would recall through the sounds and the events that happened. The little kid running in front of me just as the sun came out behind the cloud, and all those kinds of elements I would draw upon to bring back into my memory those actual words. And then I realized, in fact, that's what our people do. They're so brilliant. That's why oral history is not a deficit to a written history. It's actually more immersive, because you have to bring dance and song and color and drama and fire and sense and the sacred medicines, all these things that help create this very sensual, very immersive environment in which we all are participating in, as we hear, as we hear what we are being, asked to witness, to ask to experience, asked to be part of, so that, that all the generations forward will still have that memory, because it will be passed on and will be given on to each generation. And so I think that's kind of like one of the things that I've always drawn upon in my filmmaking, is to try to create those sort of immersive experiences, to make my films as beautiful and as sensual and so on that I possibly can. I'm going to sort of leap forward now to talking a little bit about the children's series that I created, 2 children's series, one called Nahio Tan, and then the other one called Coyote's Crazy Smart Science Show. Of course, when I went out, made all these films and won all these awards and, all this stuff, didn't mean anything. So I went looking for work, and oh no, well, we only hire the people that are trained by whoever, or whatever, So I realized, well, I got to produce myself. I've got to find my own way of making a living, and certainly one of the things I see is there's not enough of our children on camera, on screens. Our children get to see themselves. They don't get to see themselves in positive ways, and they need agency. They need agency not just as Mickey Mouse Club kind of replicants, but actual being themselves, and being themselves in the real world. So the first show was about learning Cree in the city, and also finding good ways of living in the city. I'm very lucky we had Josephine Small from Musqueam, who was our teacher, and we had these little kids go out and learn these words and have fun in the city. And then later it was Coyote's Crazy Smart Science Show, which is another thing about immersion, because the idea of learning, how do we learn? And it really tried to embody that in both of those series, so that the kids aren't being told what to think. They aren't being told to what they have to remember, although we certainly had lessons of how to say the word, but it was more using the word, seeing the word, experiencing the word. So they would just say the word dance. They would actually go dance. They wouldn't just say the word powwow. We actually had a powwow. So there was all those kinds of ways of intertwining it. So I quickly want to go to Coyote Science. And this is one of the, let's see if I can find it easy enough here. I'll do season 2. And this is just a trailer from Coyote Science. And I'm going to show you the trailer, and then I'll quickly talk a little bit about it.
Seventy % of the Earth is ocean. That's almost 3/4 of the Earth.
So water has to be protected, and we have to do our part to honor it as a living being.
Did you know that I'm standing in the ring of fire?
One of the tools we use to get ready to go to space is virtual reality.
At one time or another, the buffalo roamed freely in this territory. And that buffalo brought about what we call eco-balance.
Buffaloes are vital to the prairies. They provide food to the grizzlies, wolves, and humans. And birds feed on the seeds and insects in the buffalo bison dung, AKA poop. Yep, it's true. Bugs thrive in the dung.
Did you know skateboarding also involves science? Especially physics. Say what? Physics?
All right, so Coyote Science is very much sort of based on the principles of Indigenous education and knowledge, and particularly around Indigenous science, which is again another form of immersion. So you learn from place. Indigenous science is very much based on learning from place, and that requires observation. And observation requires being immersed in your environment, looking, hearing, feeling, smelling, all the things that you experience through learning from place. Also in Indigenous science, but in Indigenous learning in general, you're also learning through story. So story is another way to go back to Doreen Jensen, in which you're immersed in the experience of the story and the knowledge that's being shared. You become it, you go there in your own way. You're not being, made into some strange character that, then you have to inhabit to go in as, like your avatar into the story. It's you going there. It's Doreen being in those stories with her elders, and me being with the silly toys. And another way that we also learn is by doing, by experiential. So it very much Coyote Science also and it reinforces that. It reinforces through doing, through these little sort of experiments that the kids get to do and see, and and stories reinforce. So it's not just one story. It's the story kind of there's different ways the story is shared each episode, which might be about the Big Bang, because certainly there are stories that sort of seem to be similar to what science is the Big Bang, which is basically first there was an idea of something, and then there was something. So I've got 15 more minutes, right, Janine? So
Yes, you do.
okay, so I'm trying to think about where next to go, which kind of brings me to reciprocity. So in that immersive experience, in that oral tradition experience, in which you're basically remembering those moments, there's reciprocity. I mean, I'm fortunate to live long enough here on the coast, and I've had enough good people invite me to Longhouse for namings, and there's witnessing, and there's a process. That reciprocity of that witnessing happens. There's a protocol. There's a whole long held practice for that, and the same on the prairies, and in Métis and Creek culture, there's ways of reciprocity, and probably one of the main ways of reciprocity is through kindness, through being kind to yourself, being kind to others. And so as a filmmaker, how does that factor in? Do I have to think about being kind to my viewer? I have to be kind to my crew. I have to be, have that leadership. I have to make sure that, things getting done in the way they need to get done, and that, we have the resources to do them. But at the same time, there's a reciprocity, and the reciprocity is based on respect and kindness. And so that then kind of factors into, how do you tell stories? Are you gentle with the people who view? Do you need to be gentle? Do you need to just, to kick people in the gut? Like, what is that relationship? What is reciprocity, in this sort of shared immersive experience that a filmmaker is setting out into the world? And how do we kind of like honor the cultural specificity of the stories that we're telling? I mean, I was very fortunate in my first film with those lovely women, Dr. Ann Anderson and Olive Dickinson and Eva Cardinal. And while we had shared cultural experience, of course, they were elders by then, And so their lived experience was different than mine. But we had certainly had shared, so where was that site of reciprocity? How do I honor them? And that came back to that idea of hopefulness, immersing the story in hopefulness. But I wanted to talk a little bit about feature films and narrative films as well, because one of the biggest struggles I've had as an Indigenous filmmaker is this idea of when you're writing, and things have changed because there's so many different forms of storytelling now. But at the beginning, there was always this idea that you had to have conflict, that the characters had to have conflict, that there was the only way to tell story was through conflict, that the character had to need something and they had to go for it, and there would be conflicts, there'd be challenges in the way, and that would be the story, that would be the basis. And it's the basis of Western storytelling. And I guess Western storytelling would go back to say, oh wow, that's also comes from the Greeks, it comes from time honored and very long ago methods, Shakespeare, all these things. But I always struggled with that. I always really, maybe that's why it took so many years to make Monkey Beach, because whenever we wrote a script or I wrote a script, or that would be always the feedback. Well, there's not enough conflict. And so in the case of Indigenous people, that conflict is often portrayed by trauma. It's portrayed by which I've always felt was kind of like, again, I'm going back to reciprocity. How do people experience? Do I want people to really experience trauma? When you run away at 13, you experience trauma, and I don't need to go into what that could be like. You're hitchhiking around the world, as I did, around Canada, anyways. And some good people, some not so good people, some with, I won't go into it. But in any case, so is there, what is the way to best share this? And I know that recently I was reading about different ways of looking at conflict. So I'm just going to kind of quote something here before I just show you a little bit about Monkey Beach. And it's just actually a quote from the conversation that a couple of filmmakers had, and I can't remember them right now, the names. I could share it with you later if you want. She says, what I take issue with is that the conflict is not only considered the primary narrative engine, it's also a tool to whittle a character down to some fundamental essence. A character is supposed to have a want, an external goal, and a need, which represents the internal emotional something they are after. The external goal is really just a ruse in pursuit of the internal goal, and it's going to lead the character to its internal discovery that they need to make. And the conflict is a thing that allows this to happen. So basically in screenwriting, conflict is a tool to generate self-knowledge. And I take issue with that, particularly because as someone with a marginalized identity, in the case of this writer, conflict has been the place where I find self-knowledge. Conflict has not been the place where I find self-knowledge. Conflict is the place where I have to engage with all kinds of self-protection mechanisms, for example, and disguise myself in a world so that I don't get hurt. And I'm not alone in that. That is many marginalized people's stories. So that, I think when I read that, I was thinking, hey, gee, that's actually what I've been feeling and saying for like ever. Like, why do I want to, someone who's experienced conflict, someone who's experienced trauma, someone who's experienced violence on many levels, in many ways, how can I do, is that what I want to drive my stories? And so to hear it put so succinctly, so beautifully, because this is the idea that, conflict is self-protection. I have to protect myself against it. And we don't always do it that well. I mean, I have many coping mechanisms for the kind of traumas and things. And often it's like, oh, and I realize now when I look on reflection, how I lent and particularly in my last big project, how I let many bullying and abusive behaviors go unchallenged because I felt I had no other choice. And because I wanted to make my film, because it had taken so long for me to make my film. But interestingly, and then I know there was a kind of like, after making, I'm going to talk about Monkey Beach now. And after making Monkey Beach, you know, there's, I can't say for sure every choice I made was because of was the choice necessarily toward this experience of immersion, although I definitely feel it's very much about the immersive, dreamlike, poetic place. But some of it was because of one, lack of resources in terms of what was available to me as a filmmaker. There might have been more available to other people who were part of the making of the film, and also just the logistics of getting everybody up to Kitimat was very, very expensive. And I was determined to make the film in Kitimat because I felt it was part of reciprocity, giving back to the community whose story the story was born. But it was, but I know some people would like, well, you know, you're dealing with all these really heavy things, and yet you're not, it's not showing it. I'm not showing, well, which is basically talked about in the film, the sexual assault, the rape. I'm not showing it. But perhaps in Eden Robinson's other books, she was more explicit, but in Monkey Beach, she doesn't explicitly show a rape. And so to me, it was important to think about this sort of like, what is this reciprocity? What is this relationship do I have with trauma and conflict? And what is my role in terms of what that story, how that story is going to be told? And one of the things that was really important to me was that I want to be authentic, to have a sense of authenticity, that this is our real people. And the other thing that was important to me is that at the end of the film, you know, young people who are, you know, it's not for little kids, obviously, but it's, you know, for kids, you know, over 12, seeing the film and saying, I want to embody the power, my powers, in the way that the main character, Lisa, can embody her powers. And that what was really important to me. That was what, and that embodiment and that immersion into your own power was really important. And can it come out of not just conflict and trauma? Although certainly in the story, it comes out of drama. And this writer who goes on to talk about, you know, trying to make film beyond conflict, she talks about tension. She said it's tension that really is what drives her characters and drives her stories, and actually really drives drama when you think about it, the kind of tension that can be built within a scene, a tension that can be built, you know, in the story, and the tension that a character feels as they're, you know, searching. Not, and I don't even think, you know, they always talk about what they want. And I always think that's a very Western thing, because, you know, Western people are very goal oriented. It's like, oh yeah, I want to get rich, or I want to get this, or I want to get fame, or I want to get that. I mean, I think that is kind of contrary to this, what's caused us to get into this mess in the first place. So I think this idea of wanting is different than just, you know, being in this relationship to the universe, to our family, to the land, to future generations, is much more one of reciprocity. But with that comes tension, and tension is also energy. So I guess the question here, I'm not sure, Janine, I can either show the trailer to Monkey Beach, or I can show the scene from Monkey Beach that's around residential schools, because I don't think I could do both. I'll take your advice there, Janine.
Maybe let's show the scene, and if Mitch, you can put the trailer in the chat so people can watch later, that'd be great.
Okay, so I'll show the scene. I just got to get to that, go back to the right. Hang on. So it would be there, and it would be here. Okay. Now I'm going to quickly set this up. It's the family is at Monkey Beach, and they're sitting around the fire. It's at night, and the rest of it's pretty self-explanatory. The only thing I would add is that at some point someone said to me that they felt that this was the way we really, our people, talk amongst ourselves without white people being around, having to explain everything to them, just about, within our own communities, within our own families, talking about the experience of residential school.
You're crazy.
I'm crazy. Your church is crazy. I mean, look at what they did. You know what they did to Trudy, to me, to Josh?
Sorry, it wasn't showing, right? It just, you could hear it. So I'm going to go back again.
And that makes it okay?
You're crazy.
I'm crazy. Your church is crazy. I mean, look at what they did. You know what they did to Trudy, to me, to Josh?
We know what they did. Nick, get over it. Josh has.
Really? You think he's gotten over it?
Mick, please. You're scaring the kids.
It's good. They have to know what happened to us. You never went to residential school, so you can't tell me what I went through and what I didn't. Al, you were there, you know.
Yeah, I was there for a couple of years, but you're right, Mick. You're absolutely right.
I wasn't telling you anything. I was just saying grace.
You're buying into a religion that thought the best way to make us white was to torture children.
Enough. God damn it!
Yeah, come on, Mick. Let's keep calm.
They were bleaching us white, Al. Tortured us, kids. And that's your religion, Edith. Your God tortures. He let children be raped.
Mick! You need to stop. Now's not the time. You have every right to be upset. Yes, we are all hurting from those days. A few years. Yeah. When they're old enough. Tell them. Tell them everything. Because they do need to know, but right now, you're making everybody upset.
Contacting the dead.
So that's basically 4:30. And I really, 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 really appreciate it and really, really value you all being here. And I guess tomorrow, we do questions and answers. So thank you and much respect and everything else. And I'm going to go outside now.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. And I look forward to really unpacking the sharings here today, because you left me with some pretty good reflections that I think I can bring to tomorrow's conversation. And we welcome everyone back to join us and help unpack the presentation and bring your questions as well.
Okay. So
I'll also go enjoy the sun. Yeah. To Nikki.
Okay, so take care. Hi.
Well, Tansa Tawa, welcome back, everyone. Really appreciate hearing that song from Jessica McMahon, Beverly McIver, and Karen Shepard. That was actually performed here at the Banff Centre in August 2022 of last year, and feels very appropriate to start our session, as the song called Inni was also honoring Sacred Guardian Buffalo Mountain, where Banff Centre is now situated. And so for those of you who are joining us for the first time, my name is Janine Wendolf. I'm the Director of Indigenous Arts here at the Banff Centre. I'm originally from La Ronge, Saskatchewan, so Treaty 6 area, Woodland Cree. My family hails from Waswanipi Cree Nation, so we're part of the James Bay Agreement. but I raised my 2 children, Delari and Corin, in Treaty 4 territory of Regina, Saskatchewan, but now find myself in Banff, Treaty 7 area and call it home. And so I'm excited today to be in conversation with Loretta. So I'll welcome Loretta on screen with me. And yeah, I look forward to the next, I guess, what, 50 some minutes together.
I hope I have something to say, but I'll try. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the original invitation. And I hope the stumbling over my words yesterday wasn't too distracting. And I really do value being here. And I value, again, being on unceded territories in Squamish here in Gibsons. And yeah, it's interesting coming to, in some ways, when you do these things, it's sort of like coming to know yourself, because that whole story about wanting to be a ballet dancer, I kind of like thought, would I ever tell anybody that? It was so silly. And yet it just seemed to work seamlessly with what I felt I needed to say. So
Oh, definitely. Yeah, a lot of sharing. And at least in this session, we can talk to each other, because I was actually just knowing my experience with webinars when I'm alone on screen. It's a little bit more comfortable to be, yeah, in conversation. So I always like these second sessions as well. But yeah, we were talking quite a bit about coyote science. We got through some conversations with Monkey Beach, as well as hearing some conversations on your experience in the film industry. And so kind of gave a lot to, yeah, absorb and reflect on. And so as part of it, I did have, some questions that I had in conversations, but I also want to welcome anyone joining us today to put the questions in the chat, and I'll read them out loud, and we can, yeah, invite everyone into this conversation together. And so, yeah, talking a little bit about, oh, Anna Love the Ballet Antidote is joining from Puerto Rico. Awesome. Welcome, Anna. And so, yeah, I was thinking a little bit about that conversation. I had noted my background, but before coming here to Banff, my main focus was always documentary filmmaking, and also had made my own feature film, but knowing that there was a lot of work that happened before I came into the industry itself. When I first entered, I think one of the things that was difficult for me was actually one of the conversation points you brought up, which was this idea of how trauma was motivating stories, and how you used the word tension, which I actually really liked better. And so in one of my documentaries, because I was trying to acknowledge truth, but focus on intergenerational healing, I got a little bit of feedback that I wasn't being true to myself, because I wasn't acknowledging traumas within film. But it was actually called Stories Are in Our Bones, and it was about my kids learning fishing. So I kind of felt like they were putting that onto my children, even though my children had a very different experience from myself and my mom and my grandparents. And so, yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about, how you came to that realization in terms of a better usage of words.
well, my very first film I made actually was, well, I had done all these smaller videos for organizations or my experimental work, but my very first official film was The Learning Path, which I showed. And that film, I remember, as I mentioned, that I asked Dr. Ann Anderson and Olive Dickinson and Eva Cardinal what kind of film did they want, and they all said hopeful. And ever since then, I've always asked everybody the same question, and every time the answer is always hopeful. And so here's these elders who've been through so much, Eva had gone to a residential school, Olive had, Dr. Ann had, and in that film, they share some of their experiences. And in fact, they shared even more terrible experiences, which we all agreed we wouldn't put in the film. But even despite that, they were hopeful. I mean, I think that's really what was, well, there are teachers, right? There are matriarchs, there are, they're the ones who are leading the way and telling us that's what we need. And so I sort of took that to heart. And so ever since then, I've always tried to live up to that hopeful. But it's interesting you say that about you getting feedback. because I remember when I took the film out, the film board, you know, it was a co-production with the film board. I didn't produce it, but Terry Green was the producer locally. But one of the things they said was I was going to interviews to, you know, radio, you know, so on when they were doing the media. And I was there with someone that worked for the film board or had been hired, I think, by the film board to do the media relations. And we were sitting waiting to go in and do the interview with the radio channel. And she said to me, well, you know, your film, you talk about hopefulness, but she said, that's not real. That's not the way it really is in your communities, right? And it was like, so somehow there's this perception that we have to live in our trauma forever in order to be Indigenous. And so I think that was kind of also hit me. And I thought, oh, you know, so you don't want to see beauty. You don't want to see poetry. You just want to see our trauma. And that's, you know, going back 30 years. And it's still, you know, I've heard similar since then, you know, and like I said, I was even a little kind of like worried, and I get that feedback. Actually, somebody who could know a lot, who was very close to Monkey Beach, said to me, well, you know, it's a film that aunties and grandmothers will really like. And I thought, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, really, what's wrong with that? You know, I mean, so you know, as far as I've found out, actually, it's not just aunties and grandmothers who love it. Actually, kids love it. You know, men love it. You know, anybody who's had to deal with grief, and that includes non-Indigenous people, love it. So, you know, I think healing is really critical, but not, you know, maybe everybody's made differently. So every filmmaker's made differently. And so, and their influences are different. I mean, and so maybe, you know, I think one of the things is because I deal a lot with anxiety myself, that sometimes I can't even watch, like I followed, you know, I watch all the Game of Thrones, but some of the battle scenes, like some of the worst battle scenes, I had to leave the room because of the tension was just too much for me. So I'm very conscious of what the reaction will be in the audience, like how people would, and I think it's kind of like an intuitive thing. Maybe if people, maybe you're similar to me, we're more, what's that word they say, empaths. So when you have a lot of that, like even if I see someone cut themselves a fall, I can feel the hurt, like the cut in my hand or wherever that they fell. I can feel the pain in my knees. Like I would never make a good doctor or a nurse. So, you know, so I think that those are sort of, you know, things that, yeah, we do have to change, I think, the language. Yes, we can still deal with that. I mean, I also mentioned that to sometime, I mentioned that to an elder once, and they said, well, you know, but some people need to see that. They still need to see the trauma. Some people need to go through it to see it. And other people, you know, so there's room for everything. I think that's one of the issues, is that somehow we've been confined, and it's like, oh, well, no, this isn't it. This is the only way you can tell the story, or this is the only story you can tell. When there's so many stories, and there's so many ways we can tell the story, and there's so many, you know, ways that we can kind of conjure up, you know, the way that the story comes to life. And one of the quote I took about, you know, writing and creating characters, and how this woman changed from, you know, conflict to tension, that also kind of made me think about, you know, we're, as human beings, we're full of so many emotions and so many feelings, and sometimes they contradict. Sometimes, you know, like you're feeling this way one day and the next day, oh, who knows? So we're such complex beings that Indigenous people have been kind of reduced to these sort of like very kind of simple tropes. But I think it's critical that we show those complex, you know, complexities of our emotions, of our experience. And and that means that we have to have that breadth of stories and breadth of storytelling, you know, to really decolonize the narrative.
Yeah, definitely. Like I really appreciated that conversation, because I think of a lot of our emerging and early into film storytellers, so whichever age, but I know that when they're going for funding, there's always this pressure that we have to fit in a certain type of narrative. So yeah, that distinction, and actually even Eartha in a chat also loves the distinction between conflict or trauma. and tension. I think that's an important one to continue having, especially as people are developing their stories and sharing them, rather than shaping our stories to fit the funding mold.
Well,
They should
that's
fit
funny.
us.
Yeah, no, it's funny too. I mean, I've heard from enough young emerging filmmakers to tell me, well, I just want to make horror films so I can get famous, and then I can go off and make my own films that I want to make. And it's like, well, I don't know if they realize that there's so many horror films out there that I don't know. I mean, I guess you're going to get attention, but I mean, I was fortunate, and I don't want to brag, but I was part of the ISO delegation to the Cannes Film Festival this year. And they have an exhibit hall. So filmmakers and films and companies from all over the world are there exhibiting their films, trying to get buyers to come in and, look at their films and buy them and so on. And I would say 75 to 80% of it was horror. So it's like, there's going to come a point where we're going to, the market's going to go, well, okay, that's enough horror, so in fact, I just wrote a script recently called The Last Zombie Movie. So, and I'm hoping it's the last zombie movie, but I mean, the other thing about horror, which is kind of interesting, I know it's maybe not directly what we're talking about. One of those interesting things about horror is that, remember, it's not only a couple of years ago, I remember hearing an interview with Stephen King, who's, the king of horror. And he actually said he didn't like a lot of horror these days because the monster wins. And I think that's very debilitating to a consciousness of humanity when that happens. I think it's really critical that it's that hopefulness comes back. So even when you're dealing with horror, there's not everybody dies. I mean, I just watched a film on what was it called? Can't even remember if it was a Netflix film. Anyways, one of the main characters gets shot like our last 2 minutes of the film, and I'm going, that was unnecessary. It really, really was unnecessary. And it kind of like just was a jarring emotional thing, which there's no resolution for because the film's over, and actually he was a really interesting character. And there was, it's just thought, like, why did they do that? And, even even another weird thing was recently I was watching, anyways, I'll have sci-fi. I'll have to remember it. I can't remember it right now. But anyways, no, I think we do have to. I mean, and that's not unusual. I mean, feminists changed. They worked on changing the actual vocabulary film. I mean, when I first started making film, they were still calling certain lights blondes and redheads and that kind of stuff. And there's been enough analysis that has gone into how the very technology of film comes out of a very patriarchal kind of, language and perception of the world. So, yeah, I mean, feminists have done it, the Black community, have every kind of person who's been marginalized from film and the language of film and the structure of film have, worked to dismantle. There's that famous quote that I think a lot of our young people didn't ever hear was, but this is also a thing. And Chinman Ha, was it Chinman Ha, was it Bell Hooks, or was it Audre Lorde? I can't remember, but one of them said that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. And that's something that I've always struggled with as a filmmaker. It's like, how do I work not only within the system, and I'm always on the edge of it. I've always been an outsider. I've always been an outlier. I've never been, in the inner circle by any means, but I'm still part of it, and I'm also using the same, language and even the grammar of film, wide shot, close up, medium, all those sort of things. So how can I truly dismantle, right? And so there's always been that struggle. I mean, for some more experimental filmmakers, what it meant to them was just that they would just have one 1 hour long take, or they would have, everything was fractured, and so there's, everybody's kind of try to deal with it in their own way. But for me, I think it came back to emotions. I think it was emotions, because I think for a large part, as Indigenous people, we're not perceived to have emotions. We're not perceived to have feelings. So I mean, how else can we have so many of our children and our women and our men, be basically, killed? Like there's no empathy for us, so I think it's really important for our full breadth of our emotions to be expressed. And that includes love.
Yeah.
I don't think we see enough love stories. There's really not enough Indigenous love stories. And I think that's really, really, really important as well.
Yeah, definitely the more holistic view of our peoples and experiences. Yeah. I'm going to go to the chat. We actually have one from Luann Neal who says, "Hi, Loretta. I appreciated your initial thoughts yesterday around decolonizing narratives, and in particular, the structure, or is it practice of Western film always taking the approach of needing conflict? Do you find this creates a barrier for new and emerging Indigenous filmmakers in creating their first works?"
Well, I go back to when I was going to film school, and I was kind of like just starting out, and I was felt, alone, lonely. And I was fortunate that I was dear, the late Len George was kind enough to welcome me, and my family into his family. And so I worked for him, when he started the Chief Len George Foundation back in the day, and I worked in a little trailer on the res there. And anyways, we cooked up an Indigenous training program, and it was at CapU, or it was then college, Capilano College, and it was a 1-year program. And the amazing late Barb Cramner there, and all a lot of other really, really talented people like Tracy Kimbono. And I always feel bad about not saying everybody's name, but it was a program. And I remember one of the instructors having this kind of debate with him, because I said, Indigenous filmmaking is different. And there's always this kind of thing they say to you, well, yeah, but you got to learn the rules to be able to break the rules. And it was like, well, yeah, but they're your rules, and certainly they come with not just a history, but they come with some kind of understanding of the human experience. So, you establish your shot so you know where you are, and then you go in closer and so on. So, I mean, there certainly is, structure there. There certainly is a way that's going to be predetermined that comes out of, its own, and the other thing that comes in, Luann, you would maybe appreciate this, you look at a lot of film, it comes out of Western art tradition. So you see, I mean, I do it myself. I frame shots to look like, I'm influenced by Native artists, particularly like Alan Sapp. When I made Forgotten Warriors, a lot of the imagery was influenced by Alan Sapp, and his beautiful images of village life and so on, and back in the day. And so Western filmmaking is very much influenced by that, by the lighting, the even the way the camera is, depth of field, all those things, applied directly, seem to have a relationship to Western art. But when you look at the many forms of Indigenous art that come out of different expressions of form and line, and relationship to two-dimensional and three-dimensional, in relationship to positive and to negative spaces, all these kinds of things have never really been able to give full expression, because they do. We're expected to learn the rules first, and that also applies to scripts. So the scripts, you're supposed to have 3 acts of plot points. At the end of the first act, you have a sort of event that sort of propels the script. And I remember challenging that even amongst other Indigenous writers. I mean, I was in a class once, and I'm sure that's maybe why I'm an outsider, but it was an NSI first features, and they had a lady, a lovely woman, teaching us about script writing, and she was using Thelma and Louise as an example of the best script, and how it was structured, and it was all good, and I'm happy. I mean, it was a good film. It wasn't my favorite film in the world, but there was things about it that I liked. performances for sure. And then, but I remember sitting there saying, well, but yeah, okay, great. This is great. I really appreciate you. You're wonderful. You're wonderful. But we're not really talking about Indigenous script writing. And I remember all the other sort of members turning their head to me. And the others said, just shut up, Loretta. We're just here to learn. If you think you're just some kind of like, I'm kind of putting words in their heads. I'm sure they didn't. They maybe, but I did, but some of them did say, we're here to learn, we're here to, this is, it's like, oh, come on, you can learn that from just reading a book, and sure, this person can give you an example of Western, script tradition, and they can give you the Western concept and, how, but really we're here to dismantle that, to basically, decolonize that. And so it's always been a bit of a battle. But when I started watching films from around the world, and I saw how they were coming at it from their own aesthetic and their own cultural experience with time and space and form and shadow and light, and you start to see how, yes, everybody can't kind of get away from Western tradition because, of course, they took up the film camera, from Lumiere and from the beginning. But they didn't have the constant onslaught of that sort of stuff that we have in North America. And so you see that difference. I mean, I saw a beautiful film called City of Sadness once that was a Taiwanese film, and it was almost all what would be called tableau. It was almost always a wide shot. There was maybe, I counted, maybe about 5 medium shots and maybe 2 close-ups in the whole film. And it was so beautiful, but it definitely referenced the sort of, the art of, you see a lot of Asian art where you see this panel being, painted where there's, a scene there, then a scene there, there's people there. And it really felt like it was coming out of the art. And, and the same when I started, I was lucky, because I've been able to be in places where, you can access films that you would probably, now you could see maybe because of the internet, but back in the day you couldn't. So I was lucky enough to go to, for instance, an African film festival once in New York. And again, a different sensibility to time, to space, to even the horizon, and people's, relationship to one another within the space, all those kinds of things that are coming out of a different sensibility. I don't know whether we've done enough. I think I try our best. I could tell IM4 Lab, and I'm sure they do at the Indigenous digital program, all the other Indigenous film programs. I realize that, everybody's in their own way trying to, kind of bring a different way of looking at storytelling, but there's still always that pressure, like even making Monkey Beach. I don't know how many times the script was written and they would say, tell a film, well, it's not quite there yet. It's not quite there yet because it wasn't Western enough, And so, because that question of, well, what does, Lisa want, So then I guess, resort to horror or resort to trauma or resort to, the expectations that, non-Indigenous people have of us and have of our storytelling. So it's, another film I really, really value is, which I thought was very, very close to Indigenous storytelling, was Sterling Harjol's film, Barking Water. And it's a film in which a man who's kind of at the end of his life, wanting to go back and do his kind of goodbyes and his sorries, apologies, to people he's hurt in his life. And he goes to an old lover he had and asks her to go on that journey with him. And it's very elliptical. And, it was not big budget, but there was a kind of a lyricism there. And there was a kind of sovereignty over this emotional space of everybody in that film that I felt very heartening, I guess. And, I felt closer to the way in which I sometimes experience story. And so, yeah, it can be. I mean, I wonder, that's one of the reasons I created the IM4 Lab, even though we're working in a different technology, we're working in AR and VR. Now, it was a chance to be able to kind of like really make those technologies serve us. Yeah. Yeah, and the film was Barking Water. So I don't know if that helps, Luann, but yeah, it can be. It certainly is a challenge to sort of, I mean, and one of the things I did once in class, the last sort of full semester class that I ever taught was I asked the students to, it's about native aesthetic and filmmaking. And I showed a German film. I showed Run Lola Run, because how that story was very, every time she would do something different, it would change the story. And it sort of looked at time and space and consequence differently. So even physics, our physics, sort of, there you are in Blackfoot territory amongst the many other territories. Even the physics of story is different. And I think, I think that's something that we need to explore more. And I really wish there was more space to do that. We kind of were starting to do that in the 90s. Actually, the Indigenous Arts that's, you're so generous and kind to be leading now. That was actually started by Margie Bocage and myself and Maria Campbell and a few other people whose names again are Amethyst First Writer. And other people, great people, and that was the purpose, was to be able to do that and to even have that discussion, because we just don't seem to be able. We have the discussion now, but it's usually about markets and pitching and budgets and grants and so on. And it would be nice just to have the space to just and I hate the word aesthetic because it sort of sounds so snobby, but just to explore our own visual language, and where it comes from, and to let it just flow freely.
Yeah, and we do have a few people who actually said, so Art Proctor said Run Lola Run is one of my favorite films, and Eartha agrees, that's a great movie. There is someone who's got Barking Water question.
Yeah,
It's Anna.
I think that was the name of the film, Barking Water. I'm pretty sure it's called Barking Water. The other thing I wanted to say about that class I taught, I asked people to bring together their sort of like a Western film and sort of a fairy tale or a mythical type film, and a sort of a story or kind of like a trickster character or something from their own community, and do a mashup. And that was really cool because we had people doing things like Sedna, there was Indigenous, amazing Inuit filmmaker. Again, sorry, I really apologize for getting people's names right now because she's great. And, I'm friends with her on Facebook and she's helped me out on my films and so on. And I apologize. I'll try to look it up. But anyway, she did Sedna and Little Mermaid. And, so people were doing these, somebody who sadly passed away, a young man who was amazing. He did the Three Stooges and the Trickster, the Raven. And, so there was just, I think, those kinds of things where we don't have to feel like we have to fit into them, but we can take their thing and dismantle it and, use it as kind of like, paints, if you like, to kind of like color our own stories in new and in unique ways.
Yeah, I like that idea because, that's one thing that my mom taught me, was that when we were introduced to things like, say, the cast iron, I was saying, well, does that change who we are as Indigenous people? Does that make us still Indigenous? She said, well, yeah, it made it cooking faster so we could do a lot more quilling and beading on the side, freed up time, but we'd still put our own ingredients in there. We'd still use it in our own way. We made it work for us. So it was adapting the tool. And she told me never to forget, because I was going into film and questioning the nature of the medium and what that does to my oral storytelling indigeneity. And that's another tool. And kind of in her own way with the cast iron was telling me the same thing you're saying in a different way. Is that you have to make it your own. And so I really appreciate that conversation.
That's cool. It's good to hear. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the other thing is another reason why, to take that even another step further, why I created Coyote Science was that we're actually doing, even though we didn't have cast iron pots, we had technologies that were, as sophisticated as anything in Europe. We knew about metals, we knew about, we knew all those things, and some sadly was lost to time because of disease and genocide and other things, but that's still there. Indigenous science, in a way, it's sort of like a similar thing. It's like Indigenous science comes out of a different relationship to the environment, and so the technology serves a different purpose. And so, it's how it's constructed. It's constructed of local materials. It's sustainable materials. There's many ways that go into constructing it, and I think that's really critical too. Is that, that's, those are sort of things that we have to think about as well. It's like, and that's why I really love VR and AR in a way, because conceptually, we already thinking that way, and all it is some software, and some technology that is closer to the way we think than the way is sort of thought of in Western culture. So I thought that's one of the reasons why, that stories are always there, that what we may not see it, but there's energy and beings and things all around us, and I think that's what those technologies kind of like help us experience those things.
I'm going to go to the chat again. And so Anna is asking, do you worry about the industry labeling, this is Indigenous, this is Creole, this is Asian, that is then commodifying the narratives and creating the very limits we're trying to challenge?
Well, again, because of the sovereignty of nations, Senegal filmmakers don't have to say, though, they're Senegal filmmakers and they're coming out of Senegal, or they're, Chinese filmmakers and they're coming out, but they don't have to, to them, it's just storytelling, right? It's their storytelling, but that's because they have control. And I hate to sound, this is like a throwback to film school, means of production. They own the means of production. So it's just their filmmaking, because they can, not to say that in Senegal, the wonderful filmmakers that have come out of there didn't have, to struggle and, still struggling and being able to have access to, equipment and the resources to make films. But I think that's been part of the other problem, is that in Canada, and I imagine the same in the States, we're sort of, we've already been commodified. So Indigenous people were commodified. We're just basically, something that kind of like can be inserted into a film, or, we can, so everything about us has been commodified. So, and even now, there's that look toward, well, what can we get out of this? I've said this before, and it might sound cynical and it might sound like sour grapes, but, producers who 20 years ago wouldn't even give me the time of day, wouldn't even answer my calls or emails, are now suddenly, the champions of Indigenous storytelling, because, hey, they could make money off it now. So they, but we still don't own the means of production, so we're still, even though, and remind everybody that APTN is asking for letters of support by July 31st, because they are trying to initiate an all Indigenous language channel, and that, please go and write those letters of support, because it would certainly help us in this, owning the means of production. So I think that's what would really change it. And that's what the kind of work that we were trying to do back in the 90s. We were trying to create kind of collectively the means so that we could all have the freedom to tell the stories the way we want to tell them. And it, sure, it would be Indigenous, but it would be, it would be us. It would be us. It would be Cree, it would be Métis, it would be, it would be us. And it's only, I don't know. I don't know. Kind of like, they're always going to look kind of be looking for the angle, like what can they get out of it? What's in it for them? And I don't think we can get away with that. And if being Indigenous, a film is something that they could exploit, or if it's something that they can then dismiss and marginalize. There's not much we can do about that. All we can really do is keep, kind of creating more space. And I think that's part of that decolonizing, is just creating more and more space.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So Anna also thanked you, and it says it goes back to yesterday, the issues of access to resources and means of production is significant. So
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I think I struggle a little bit even still, like we made Coyote Science, which is, really, I always say it's for Indigenous youth and their friends, and their friends could be, all the many diverse communities that are in Canada, right? So all their friends and all Canadians who want to learn about Indigenous science and learn about it in a fun way. Yes, my first audience is our children and our youth, because I think our children and our youth need their own, something that they feel is theirs, right? That this belongs to them. It's something that was meant for them, conceived for them. And it belongs to them, but they can go, hey, friend, look at this. This is what we know, and this is how we tell stories, and this is how, here's a fun way to learn about Indigenous science and Indigenous culture. But sometimes it is a bit of a struggle, because I pitched Coyote Science from day one to PBS to BBC, and even CBC finally bought it for GEM, season 1 anyways. And there was still this kind of thing, well, it's just for Indigenous people, and I think that, again, that kind of goes back to this idea that they just want our trauma. So if it's our trauma, yeah, then that will appeal to the mass market. But if it's Indigenous hip hop artists singing about Indigenous science, and Indigenous scientists, well, that's just for Indigenous people, so they can, feel better about themselves, rather than, gee, we really have something to teach. We have something that's really important to this world to know. And not only that, the way that Coyote Science empowers the youth and the children in the series, so that they themselves have agency, that they themselves are the questers that are learning and going out and finding ways to learn and learning, that's a message to all youth and all children. Because so much, I watch a lot of children's programming, because of course that's the field I'm in. So much of what I see now, it's just it's hard to describe. It's sort of like they're designed to basically create a demand for product. So basically, like Paws Patrol, and the kind of ideologies that are kind of behind these things, ultimately, this sometimes I find really disturbing. And the kind of almost kids aren't kids. They don't get to be kids. They have to be smart alecky, or they have to be this, or they have to be that. They don't just get to be kids who want to learn and have joy with learning and joy with life. I think that's an important message for all youth, all kids, so they can get a glimpse of that. Hey, that's freeing. I feel free when I experience life that way, and so yeah, yeah, it's definitely a struggle. There definitely is a sense that sometimes some of the work that we do, unless it's somehow been what's the word, vetted, through their expectations, it's harder to kind of like break through. But that's the beauty of APTN and the other Indigenous producers. I just think that you guys should watch you should watch Coyote Science. It's on Louis, and it's also fortunately APTN only shows it on their SD channel, even though I shot in 4K. I've got but oh well. But but they do show it on Lumi, and Gem shows it just season 1. I don't know why. Right, CBC tell them to buy season 2 and the upcoming season 3, which will launch on APTN in September. But I'd be happy to share a couple of episodes with the cohort here. If they like, I can. I won't put it in the chat right now because I'd have to go look for it. But I'd be happy to share a couple of the episodes to give you a sense of what that series is like. Yeah.
That sounds good. Yeah, I think Mitch, who's helping us behind the scenes, might have a way to send it to the emails. Let me know in the chat, Mitch, if that's possible. We can send it to them after. So yeah, just talking a little bit about the changing resources. Yeah, to the Coyote Science series. And so I just seen it in the chat. So I ran a festival called Miss Spawn, a celebration of Indigenous filmmaking in Regina for about 10 years. And so we had that going, but we started it through pipe ceremony. We actually at one point decided that because it's for families and the nature of it, that there was no alcohol that was going to be served during these events each year. And so as part of it, we were having trouble getting funding because a lot of people, when they hear festival, they want tourism. They want people to come, they want parties, they want galas. And so we were at the point where we weren't able to continue. So we ended up shutting down the organization. And then the next year, after TRC kind of got the swing, funding was in place, then they were asking where we went. And so, at that point, it didn't seem like people were ready for that type of, I guess, exhibition festival space, or at least to keep it in the mainstream. But, when I did that work, actually, that's where I first seen your Forgotten Warriors. It was programmed in one of the years. And so you mentioned even here, I heard of you there, and we screened the work. And then here at the Banff Centre, I felt that was really important that taking on this role, I actually understood the history of Indigenous arts and the history that it had prior to even being a department. And so, for me, it was important to bring Marjorie back and bring the voices back, because I feel like that's part of that passing of knowledge. So, those gaps don't help us move forward.
Yeah, no, it's true. I know it's been really hard to sustain, like even IM4 Lab. It's, you think it should be a no-brainer, but I mean, we've had a lot of support and it's so appreciated. But even still, you think, and there, again, not, I mean, the lovely people who have other Indigenous media labs, and they have them within, institutions like universities and so on. So it kind of opens the door up for much bigger funding. But then it also makes it a little different. It's not as accessible because you have to register at the university, you have to be accepted, there's tuition and so on. So the IM4 Lab is based on free and inclusive. So anybody can take part, anybody can take the courses. You have to, when we're doing online courses like an AR or whatever, those are a lot easier because, people can register and so on. We're doing a virtual production training right now, and that's a little bit harder because of, there has to be a certain comfort level, if you like, with some aspects of the technology, but at the same time, that idea, and that was kind of the idea of the Indigenous Arts Center, was that every type of artist could come. Every type of artist. It doesn't matter whether you were new or a master or anybody. Like, I think that's one of the things. I think that's an important value within Indigenous narrative, if you like, that everybody has a story to tell. Everybody is worthy of their stories being told. Everybody is, not everybody is, Maria Campbell, in terms of, and the other amazing writers out there, but everybody has a story to tell. And it's a way of finding the means to tell that story and to giving that, the process. And I think those kind of collaborations, my daughter did something like that to the National Film Board a few years ago, where they did Our City, Our Voices, where they had, people who had lived on the downtown east side, who were elders now, who were looking for ways to help the youth coming to the downtown east side. These were elders who had been sober for many, many years, but didn't feel like they knew their culture because, they were maybe after residential school, they left and never went home and so on. And so they wanted to find ways of being, elders. And So they were doing an elders training course for the elders of the downtown east side, and that was through an organization called the Front Door. And so my daughter brought together Indigenous emerging filmmakers and the elders to do a collaborative thing. And I think that I would like to see more of those things, because that way, you know, these people have a specialized skill, but they can apply it and give it and be, you know, for others to tell that story, to tell their stories, to let people know. I remember one of the things that Maria Campbell, in one of her books in Road Allowance People, she writes about how, you know, if you do harm, you know, if there's no good story about you, eventually you'll be forgotten. Like you'll be forgotten. People won't tell your story. You will be forgotten. And I also remember the words of James Brady, you know, great Métis leader, and his writings. He talks about, you know, he saw all these leaders that went, I think he said, unacknowledged and unremembered. And to me, so I think that what motivates me is to make sure that none of our people go unacknowledged and unremembered. And I think all these things like Indigenous arts, the work that you were doing, that festival, all those things, that's what our purpose is. But you're right, their purpose is not. It's you know, revenue, and that's okay. I mean, you know, but they can go together. You know, I mean, we had commerce, there was trade, there was an exchange of goods and services, and labor, you know, if you like. So there just wasn't, you know, a capitalist system. And so, you know, I mean, again, I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm so idealistic, and, you know, people just think, oh, but, you know, I still think that there will come a day, there will come a day. And, you know, I've seen it for sure. I'm just going to share, this is an episode of Coyote Science that is called Skateboarding. It won the UNICEF Best Children's Film at the film festival in Germany. It's called the Indianer and Inuit Film Festival, and they've changed their name now. But anyways, this year it won best children's film best children's film. So I'm going to just put it in the chat, and it's a link that doesn't require a password, so you can watch it there. People, if they get that Vimeo before we end, or Mitch can keep it as well. Yeah, anyways, I feel like I'm rambling. So anything else?
Oh, well, we got 5 minutes left, and actually I can hear the Thunderbirds going crazy. So I'm happy my internet lasted as long as it has. Better knock on wood, I might be calling something with that. But yeah, you know, just thinking, you know, the future, because we're taught to think ahead. You know, what's your vision for a holistic Indigenous storytelling community?
Well, right now, it's coming out of the I'm4 lab. I remember that I'm very fortunate to have known some really good, wonderful elders over the years. And one of them was the late Doris Peters, who's from the Peters Band up at the Fraser River, tiny little res. And she was a healer, and just a wonderful woman, really wonderful woman. And she worked with our people in prisons as well. And she said to me once, she said, our young people need to see themselves as elders. They need to be able to see themselves, getting old, and what does, and have the tools to do that. And I stopped to think about it, and I thought, she's right. I mean, when I was young, when I was a child and a youth, it's not that you want to, be driven, oh, I'm going to be a lawyer or an architect or whatever when I grow up, and blah, blah, blah. It's more like seeing yourself as being vital and valuable to your community, and to your family, and, having that sense of safety and security that you will be able to live that out. You'll be able to do that. And I never felt that growing up. There's nothing against my parents or anything like that. They loved us best they could, but I mean, in terms of that sort of colonization that basically was seeing us as extinct and, or a genocide. It was, it was inevitable, right? Because eventually assimilation would happen. I mean, even, the white paper of 1969, I mean, that wasn't that long ago. And they were basically, and then many people say they're still implementing it. It's just done in secret now. So I think that's really important. And I think, to me, I guess the structures and means at which we can do that. And it doesn't mean everyone has to be a filmmaker, but it's just, anyways, that's something I've been thinking about lately. And I came up with a project recently, which is basically based on that, which would bring elders and master artists and youth together to think about, well, how are you, think of yourself as an elder. And then also to think about what our elders will look like in 7 generations. So what is it so how can we, and the other thing is, and I'm very fortunate to, as so many of us have been, to benefit from the good teachings of someone like Leroy Littlebear, Dr. Leroy Littlebear. And he was in the film I made. He's actually been in 3 films I made. He was in Forgotten Warriors. He was in, let's see, he was in Hands of History because he was good friends with the late Joanne Cardinal, and he was also Joe Cardinal, and he was also in Forgotten Warriors. And the people go on. And he actually was very instrumental in that film because I brought a script to him and Amethyst, and they were like, they didn't say, oh, this is wrong, Loretta. He just told me a story. And I changed the script and made it better, I believe. But one of the things he talks about is sphere of influence, bringing, people into our sphere of influence. And one of the sphere of influence is the value and importance of our elders. And some people would say, well, that's their world and our world. We don't have to influence one another. But really, at this point, as the world is burning, they do need our influence, and they do need to be able to look at our elders as valuable with knowledge and importance, and that the very means by which our societies function and function for forever need to be, have agency within this world. So, power of matriarchs, the power of consensus, the power of Indigenous law. I remember working with an elder once who didn't go to residential school and barely spoke any English up in Takla Lake. And he said, we used to have conflict until we had Indian law. And he said, then when we had Indian law, we were able to resolve our differences through what he called Indian law, which would be protocols and ceremony, and in his case, the longhouse, because they brought the longhouse over closer to from the coast to where he was from. And so I think that's what some people say Indian law is just for Indigenous nation practice, sovereign practice, but it's Indian law ruled this nation, how different it would be. So that's something that I sometimes think about, and I guess as far as our future goes. As far as filmmaking goes, I just think there needs to be more and more resources out there. That I do worry, it's why I started the I4 Lab, that there's just be a few select that get the opportunities. So I will fight against that forever. And, to be honest, some of it's personal because I have been one of those ones that have been, for the opportunities I've had, I've still always been on the outside. So I think it's really critical that there be more resources for every type of filmmaker, every type of storyteller. So, that's, because again, there's aunties and there's grandmothers and there's, children and there's youth and there's, we got kids who are goths and punks and, we got, our communities of two-spiriteds and, trans, and they all have a story to tell and they all have a way of telling the story and they all need to be able to see themselves on screen. And the many screens that exist right now, not just there's so many screens now, and we need to own all those screens. And I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful. I have to. Anyways, that's my message, and I want to thank everybody who showed up yesterday and showed up today. I really value and appreciate your time and you listening. And I just really hope this can be a something that Janine, I just hope that I can do whatever I can do for the Indigenous arts. I would be happy to try to help in any way I can. And thanks to Mitch, and thanks to everybody there, and all my respect. Hi, hi.
Hi, Miigwech, Ginistomiten. Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today. And the Thunderbirds are now getting loud here, so I think
Okay.
it's a
All right, I
natural
hope it-
ending. So they're
Okay,
with us.
Take care. Okay, yeah, that's good. It's showing power. Yeah, all right.
Take care,
Okay,
everyone.
Take care. Take care.